Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? This is going to be a challenge. I have had a terrific head cold for a whole week, and I can hardly even hear myself talk. So if you can't hear me, let me know, and we'll try to pump up the volume. I want to welcome everyone to beautiful Goleta Cemetery, and I have to say that Rick and his crew did an awesome job of getting this ready for us. And they worked hard. I was here on Thursday and yesterday, and they were making sure it looked real spiffy for us all. I think they did a great job. Isn't it interesting that, do you know what today is? All Souls Day. All Souls Day. And I think you will enjoy meeting some of our interesting souls in the cemetery today. My name is Michelle Nellis, and along with Dorothy Oxner, who is helping check you in, this is the 4th time we have done a cemetery event, and it's a great way to have fun and to learn a little bit of local history and to get some of those questions answered, like how in the heck did Tucker's Grove ever get its name, or Kellogg Avenue, or Elwood School. I think you'll get some answers to those today. Now, how does the day work? You were all given name tags. Did you notice on your name tag that you had a color, either a dot or a splotch? Does that mean anything to anybody? I hope it does. How we work this is you will travel through the cemetery in groups based on the color of your name tag. And we have group leaders, and if they would hold up their colored pieces of paper so you can see. So if you have a green, you're going to follow the green lady. If you have yellow, you're going to follow the yellow man. You get the idea. Now, this is good. You're all sort of gathering. That's great. You will follow your leader to a given grave site, and you will stand there quietly while your leader introduces the resident whom you will be hearing from. Remember, the resident is dead. You cannot talk to or ask questions of the resident, because although the resident can see you and hear you, you cannot hear that resident other than as he or she tells the story. Water is provided for anyone who needs it, and on this warm day, that's probably very likely. You will be standing in sunshine through most of this, so I hope you have brought hats or an umbrella, as I had suggested. If you get tired, we do not have chairs, although I see a couple of people who did bring seats. Sit on the ground. I guess the question is, can you get up? After you have visited all 6 of the grave sites, we invite you to come to a picnic at Stowe House, and hopefully you picked up the directions at the check-in table on how to get there in case it is unfamiliar to you. And I would like to, if I see where he is, where's Rick?
Right here.
There he is. Do you have any questions? No, I'm asking the group. Do you have any? That doesn't bother anyone. And now I would like to introduce you to Rick Bowers, who is the manager of this beautiful cemetery, and he has a few words of welcome. Rick? Wait a second. Wait just a second. I'm supposed to give him this?
I wear many hats as cemetery manager, including parking attendant. Beautiful morning. Welcome. Welcome to your cemetery. It's, as some of you may know, and everyone's going to know, welcome to my home. I live here. My wife and I live here. We've lived here for 8.5 years. And I will say, when I decide to hang this career up, what I will miss the most about being sexton here is living in the cemetery. There's something special about living amongst the dead. And it's quiet, it's peaceful, it's serene, it's hallowed, blessed ground, and we love it. And when I close that gate at 5:30, it's all mine. They've asked me to talk a little bit about the cemetery, a little history about the cemetery, and I will. There's actually not a whole lot. There's good records concerning who's buried here, where they're buried, thank goodness. We've got good maps. I've got good records and information as to when the place started and when land was acquired and boundaries were changed and things like that. But as far as the day-to-day history of this place and the sections that came before me, there's not a whole lot, but I will go over some things with you. I've made some notes, which I haven't reviewed, so I will be stumbling through them. I think everybody's going to understand, be all right. But I will start out with this. Before this became a public cemetery, it was a approximately 1 acre private cemetery right up there on top of the hill, kind of right on the very top of that hill. It was owned by the Marcy family, and in 1874 there was formed the Raphael Cemetery Association. I have no idea who ramrodded that or how that got started or whose name is hooked to it. I bet Marcy's are. But anyway, in 1874, it was originally called the San Rafael Cemetery Association, and Mr. Marcy donated that 1 acre piece of land up on top, plus about 2.5 other acres, which I think are right in here, to the association. And about at the same time, there was a Mary Beck, who I think donated about 2.5 acres shortly after that. So the cemetery was basically about 5.5 acres, and that was the cemetery for quite a while. Now, of course, we have almost 18 acres total, and most of that's we're using for burials. Mr. Marcy died in 1891 and is buried with his wife and daughter right up there between the second and third tree to the right there. That's where he is buried. Ms. Beck died in 1946 and is buried up there in what we call the circle, where that round, where you're going to have a couple of actors up there. I get asked this all the time. The first recorded burial in the cemetery was in 1869, a 2-year-old boy by the name of Harry Kimber. And the Kimber plot is right up on top in what, of course, was then the Marcy Cemetery. I do not know the connection between the Kimbers and the Marcys. Now, in 1910, a petition was started to form a public cemetery district, which is, of course, what it is now. I imagined it was for the purpose of getting tax money, which is what we still do to this day. There was 152 names collected on the petition. I have a copy of that, and it was presented to the Board of Supervisors. There's some dates here for you. And on April 4th, 1910, I think that date's on, yeah, the cemetery district was formed. And the first 3 trustees were E.A. Hollister, A.M. Hole, and F.R. Simpson. They had a penchant for initials back then. I don't know why. I see that all the time. And they were the first board members. And it looked like for several decades the board meetings were held in various locations in Goleta, mostly the Goleta Valley Lemon Growers Co-op or Association, until I'm thinking around the 1920s when they started to meet here in the cemetery. I don't know a lot about the past caretakers, and they were called that for a long, long time. Their duties were simply to bury people, and that's about what they did. They didn't do much as far as the administration of the cemetery. That seemed to be taken care of mostly by the board, and some of the local mortuaries were involved in that, the record keeping and whatnot. Caretakers just buried people. One of the, I do know one, Mr. Tompkins' book, everybody knows about Goleta, the Good Land. In that, he did mention that in 1908, an immigrant from Scotland named Peter Irvine Sr. was appointed caretaker when he arrived in 1908 until his death in 1918. And he's also buried right up there by Mr. Marcy. One thing I want to talk about, you guys all probably know this because I hear it all the time. And this is mentioned in Mr. Tompkins' book. was that until 1947, to get to the old County General Hospital, you had to go on San Antonio Road. It ran right to the cemetery, right up over the railroad tracks to the hospital. And this fact was mentioned by Mr. Ripley in one of his Believe It or Not books as the only hospital in America where you went to the cemetery first instead of after visiting the hospital. And my very first day on the job, some old-timer came in my office to tell me that. And I've heard it many times, and every time I enjoy hearing it. I honestly think, and I hope I not offend any relatives of anybody here, but I think the first true general manager or sexton that was basically in charge of everything like we are now was a man by the name of Glenn Frazee. He was hired in 1954 at a salary of $250 a month. He was told to live in the residence, which I'll talk about in a minute, and he was told to be available 24/7. I am not available 24/7. I live here, but if you climb the fence and knock on my door at 2 o'clock in the morning and ask me where your grandmother's buried, I'm not going to show you. He retired in 1984. I don't think anybody will be here that long. He retired in 1984. He moved to, as soon as he retired, he moved to Arkansas. That's where he lived out his retirement. And he died in 2004. And his family brought him back here. And he's buried right up on top of the hill near that bench at the end of the road with his wife and his parents. He was replaced by Mr. Carroll Brown, who served until 2005 when I was hired. Just a couple of notes about the residents. Again, it's kind of unusual nowadays, very unusual for cemeteries to have resident managers. It's becoming kind of a thing of the past. This cemetery works well with that, and I just love to live here. I do know that there was I think the first residence, district or manager's residence was built right there, kind of where the office is now, in 1923. And that house, I think it was kind of a shack, really. That house was replaced in 1959. The house was sold for $1, and the stipulation that who bought it, and I've got his name somewhere, had to move it. So he did. He bought it for $1 and moved it. And then the house that I live in now was built in 1959, I think completed in 1960. And that is where I live now. And it had a small office right here that was replaced in about 1985 to this office right here. My house was pretty bad state when we moved in, and last year the board did. We did quite a few upgrades, and we brought it up to code, and it's very livable now, and hopefully it'll be around for about 50 more years. That's kind of all I've got as far as the history. Again, like I said, there's not a lot written about the day-to-day operation of the cemetery. But I believe the history of a cemetery are the people that are here, and we're gonna get some of that here shortly. That's where the history is. I got to put my loss control hat on before I let you go. Be very, very careful. You're going to be walking through this whole area up here. There's not a level piece of ground in this cemetery, and there's some areas that are quite steep. Go slow. Take your time. Also, as maybe a historical note, up until about the war, when we started using concrete vaults to place the casket, up until then, caskets were just buried in the grave, and if you were a family of means, then you purchased a redwood vault. Of course, over time, that wood decays and disintegrates, and the weight of the ground eventually will collapse. To this day, we occasionally backfill graves where people were buried 100 years ago. So that's what makes for more uneven ground out there. So be careful, take your time. Restrooms are around, well, walk down there, you know where the restrooms are. There is going to be traffic still going through here. We get a lot of visitors to the cemetery on weekends, so know where you are, watch out for traffic, be careful as you walk around. Enjoy your morning, and I will see you at Stowe House. I am not dead, so you can ask me questions, and I will be around. Thank you.
My name is Elwood Cooper. Andrew Jackson was the president when I was born in 1829 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. to a very strong Quaker family. I've tried to live all my life by the Quaker principles, but it's been a little hard with the war and all. But when I was 21 years of age, I was named the secretary of a commission in Lancaster County to fight that most terrible Fugitive Slave Act. And we declared that we would clothe, harbor, feed, and in all ways aid the fugitive slave to escape their master, and we did just that. In fact, we had a lot of opposition, and the next year, while we were freeing a slave, there was a riot, and the slave's master was killed. We all stood trial, but no one was found guilty. In 2 years after that, I was 24, I met my lovely wife, Emily Paxton Moore, and we married in the Quaker tradition. That means that we didn't have a minister. We Quakers don't believe in that. Shortly thereafter, I went into business with a friend of mine in Philadelphia, and he had a large plantation in Haiti. So my lovely wife and I went to Haiti and lived on his, well, you'd have to call it a plantation, and we exported things back to New York Harbor. We had ships running to Boston, ships going to Philadelphia, and I made a lot of money. But it was a sad time for me and for our whole family. We lost our 2 oldest daughters there, and I have to tell you, was deathly afraid the whole time because I hate earthquakes. And earthquakes in Port-au-Prince were a daily occurrence. Plus the fact that I got dysentery very badly. And we finally decided to come home, and I came home to New York with my family. And it was a good move. But to recover my health, I immediately took off to, where else? California, because it had been advertised as having healthy climes. And I went to Northern California, and while there I had a propitious event because I ran into a man by the name of W.W. Hollister. He was trying to buy land down near Santa Barbara, and he made it sound so beautiful and so productive that I told him to buy me some land with him next to where he was buying his land. I went back, and 2 years later, my wife and our 3 children, our 3 last children, got on the train, the brand new train that had just been cross-countryed, and we went out to San Francisco, and then with a carriage we came down to Santa Barbara, looked at our land, but there was no place to live on the ranch, so we went to town in Santa Barbara and bought a little house, corner of Anapamu and Chapala Street, for $1,100. I should tell you, by the way, that I ended up owning 2,000 acres of land in what is, well, it should have been called Cooper Canyon, but it's called Elwood Canyon. We named it Elwood. And I paid $44,000 to get that 2,000 acres of land. It was a good purchase. We lived for a little while in the city, but it was too far to travel back and forth to the ranch, so I started to build a little ranch house, and it was just a board and batten place. We thought we'd build a big, beautiful place someday, but we're Quaker people. We were simple. We didn't have parties. Who needs a big place? So we just added a room whenever we needed one. That was good enough for us. But I did love the land. It was beautiful. In fact, I wrote back to some of my family in the East shortly after we got out here, and I have the letter here somewhere. Here it is. I wrote to them, "The appearance of the valley is perfectly lovely, the prospect grand and sublime, mountains on the one side, the great ocean on the other. The people who have come here are rather above the average. This is the paradise of the Western world." And I believed it too. You can imagine the education of our children was of utmost importance to us, and so we joined together with a bunch of others, including our friends the Hollisters, and we put up something called the Santa Barbara College, a building which was to prepare our children to go off to university. It was very successful for several years, And my wife, who helped me, because I had been named the head of education in addition to my ranching responsibilities, she went back to the east and looked for teachers to come out to teach at the Santa Barbara College. And there she met a lovely young man whose name was Charles Stork, and she convinced him to leave New York and come out to California. I have great hopes for him, and he's married now. I hope he has a fine family and that they do a lot for this town. My life, to my great satisfaction, has been now spent almost entirely in horticulture. I planted on my ranch 10,000 walnut trees, 10,000 almond trees, 4,000 Japanese persimmon trees, and several thousand other trees of various nuts and fruits. Plus, I brought in and propagated and sold extensively from my land and planted on my land over 10,000 eucalyptus trees. The eucalyptus tree will be the future of California. We had a lot of visitors in those days, and they came to our ranch because our ranch was considered a very important and interesting place to be. The nephew of Queen Victoria came. He was the Consul General of Canada, and he was really impressed with our ranch, and he went away and he wrote back to me and said, California has been proven to me to be able to produce better olive than France, Spain, and Italy. And in fact, we won first prize at the Melbourne Festival in 1888 for our olive oil. And at that time I was getting $1 a bottle for it and making some serious money off my land. The other interesting visitor we had was the King of Hawaii, who came to our ranch. He was what you might call a very large man. And he thought my olive mill, which was my own production, was most interesting. But in 1880s we started to have a bad time in the orchards. Something called the willowy scale was going after the almonds, and the black scale was going after some of the other trees. And I was afraid I was going to lose my whole orchard. But indeed, I sent off, I'd done some research, sent off to China, and I received a big box full of ladybugs. And they were hungry. And I released them in the orchards, and about 3 weeks later, all of the scale was gone. Well, it got written up in all the horticultural journals, and I became fairly famous, and I was eventually named the president of the California Board of Horticulture, which I did for several years. About this time, we had a bad spell on the ranch, though, and it turns out that Mr. Hollister, my dear friend, had not gotten clear title to the land. And the Den family, from whom he had bought it and then sold to me, went to court. We fought for a little while, but then I finally settled, and I gave up a bunch of my land to the Den family, and we were settled. And it's a good thing I did, because Mr. Hollister lost in the court, and he lost his entire ranch to the Den family. My wife, my lovely wife, Sarah, died in 1908 of heart failure, although she had had asthma her whole life. I was very lonely. My children were gone. The ranch was a lonely place. I finally decided to sell it in 1912, moved into Santa Barbara, stayed at that big, beautiful hotel, which I'm sure is still standing, the beautiful Arlington Hotel, where I had a lovely, lovely suite of rooms. I was so lonely that when the widow from Chicago showed up, Mrs. Addie Fleming, even though we'd only known each other a week, I proposed and we got married. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, I was 84, she was 60, she was a spring chicken. It didn't work well. She didn't like Santa Barbara. In fact, she didn't even really like me too much, and she pretty soon split, but not before she had already signed off not to take any of my property. I lived on at the Arlington Hotel until the end of my time. I was in my 89th year when suddenly I got sick at the Arlington Hotel. And that's the last thing I remember.
I am Ezra Kerfoot Catlett, and I died of a broken heart 3 weeks after my wife passed away. I was buried at the end of June 1921 here after a very fulfilling life of 79 years. I was married to my wonderful wife, Annette Smith, for 49 years, and she bore us 2 boys and 5 girls. We were married in 1872 here in Santa Barbara. 6 of our 7 children were still alive at my death and living here in California. I was born New Year's Day, 1842, near Fort Houston, Texas. My father passed away when I was 6 years old, and I moved with my mother, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, and our slaves to a farm in Memphis, Missouri, near Mom's brother, Ezra Kerfoot. I fought for the South during the War of Northern Aggression in the 10th Missouri Infantry, entering in September 1862. I was wounded and hospitalized within only 2 months and was taken prisoner by those damn Yankees twice during my 3 years fighting for our valiant cause. After the war, I returned to Memphis, Missouri to care for the family farm and release our slaves. By 1869, my Missouri friend Tom Lillard had returned from California with fantastic tales and convinced me to move with him to farm this great new opportunity. As the paths west were treacherous, we took a train to New York, a steamer to the Isthmus of Panama, walked across to the Pacific, took another steamer to San Francisco, and another steamer to Santa Barbara. We started searching for fertile land looking in Carpinteria, Montecito, and Mission Canyon in Santa Barbara, before finding and settling in the canyon between San Jose and San Pedro Creeks, here in Goleta in March of 1869. Tom and I purchased land in the canyon until we had accumulated over 1,000 acres and raised cattle together as CL Ranch until 1891, when I bought out most of Tom's portion and moved my whole family into his much more spacious home. Our area is now called Catlett's Canyon. To make extra money, and because good lumber was scarce, I picked up the redwood dunnage used to separate ship's cargo and left on the shores of Goleta Slough. It made great construction material for Tom's house he built on Patterson Avenue, and my home up the canyon from Tom's. After 3 years at the ranch, I was convinced to pay attention to a beautiful young lady living at the next ranch. Annette had been born in Illinois, and we were married November 23rd, 1872. Our first child, Ida, was born right before Thanksgiving. Our first son, Otis Ezra, was born 1 year after our second daughter, Lenora. Our 4th child and 3rd daughter, Jessie, was born on my birthday in 1877, and she is married to Elmer Kellogg and has 2 children. Our 5th child, Sarah, died young, and her death brought great heartache to our whole family. Our 6th child and 2nd son, Earl Lewis, was born in 1881. Our last child, Nina, is married to my brother's son, Ezra Milton Catlett. So I have 6 children, 5 grandchildren, and both of my boys are still unmarried. Earl has taken over the ranch duties and will be married soon. Prior to 1868, the only way into the Santa Barbara Valley was twice monthly ships from San Francisco. But soon after Tom and I moved here, Chinese coolies brought in from San Francisco by the tongs started cutting a stagecoach road over the mountains to the train depot in Los Olivos. The path led through our land and over the exposed, bare sandstone crest, which is so smooth they had to cut ruts into the rock for the stagecoaches and grooves for the horses' hooves. Over time, the ruts became so deep they almost reached the axles. They used this route over slippery rock until 1892, when Tom made them move the road over to the ridge because he was tired of chasing down our cattle that would wander through the gate left open by the stage drivers. One day when Nettie, my wife, was preparing a chicken I had just slaughtered, she found a gold nugget in the chicken's stomach. We kept that very quiet and searched the area for several weeks, but found no more gold. In the spring of 1896, the Navy selected John Moore's and my ranches as the start and finish line for the speed trials for the new dreadnought battleship Oregon, just completed in San Francisco. They erected 2 large wooden sighting tripods on a due north line from the sea as a start line. On May 14th, hundreds of people lined the 80-foot palisades from Moore Mesa to Refugio to watch the start of the race. This magnificent ship raced up the coast to Coho Bay and back, 40 miles each way, and set an unbelievable new speed record of 20 miles an hour. Moving to Goleta has been a wonderful experience. We have raised a large family and become quite prosperous. Our family will continue to reap and provide benefits to the community for many years to come.
My name is Edward Augustus Hollister. I was born in 1851 in Fillmore, Missouri. Excuse me. My family, I'm sorry, let me start over. My name is Edward Augustus Hollister, and I was born in Fillmore, Missouri in 1851. My family moved to Santa Barbara in 1851. It turned out, in 1871, it turned out that my father had come to visit his relative, Colonel W.W. Hollister, and stayed with him for a while, and then sent for my mother and I to come and live with them. We had to come by steamship, and when we ended up arriving in Santa Barbara, we had to come by rowboat from the steamship to shore, because at that time there was no wharf to come and take care of us. Shortly after we came here, I decided I was going to get married, and so I married Anna Owens.
My family came to Santa Barbara in 1780s. They had first come from North Carolina to Visalia, and then they moved on to Santa Barbara and had a ranch right next door to the Hollisters. Well, I loved the fall, and I loved the beauty of the area, and I was just a farm girl not overly educated, but knew how to take care of the farm very well. And so my father, William, and his wife, Molly, they call her, but her name was really Laura. Yeah, they kept the farm, and then I met Edgar, and I really wanted to get married too, and he was just a great guy to be next door. So, in the 15th of October, in the fall, 1881, we were married. Well, right away, we had started to have a family. First we had Albert, then we had Owen, then we had Ethel, and she married William Strange. And then we had Chester. Well, Chester lived in the Solvang area, and he's buried up there in Ballard. And he had a ranch there too. And his brother Owen, wanting his own things, he went on up to Lompoc, and so he's buried up in Lompoc where he had his farm.
I'm sorry to say, though, in 1901, my wife passed away. Besides farming, though, I had other interests. Two of the associations I led at that time, one was the Lima Bean Association, and the other one was the Walnut Growers Association. It turns out that lima beans is probably the most profitable crop you can grow in this area. And you can make more dollars per acre than anything else, and I assume that in later life that half of this area will probably be covered with lima beans. I didn't like to live alone very long, and so I got married again, and I married Sally T. Baker.
I was born in Texas, and my father came from Kentucky, and my mother came from Missouri. They'd been in Missouri. And there's my father and my mother. They are right here with us. We're all a big family together, and we like to be together. Well, Edgar and I were married on the 31st of December, 1896. Now, the 31st of December, you know, is a special day. So we were really celebrating, no alcohol though, but we were really celebrating the New Year and our marriage. Oh, it was wonderful. It was beautiful. And then we right away started to have a family. In fact, we had William the next year, and then 2 years later we had Robert. And here's William and his wife, Catherine Kellogg, and here's Robert. They both stayed on the ranch with us, and they eventually took over the ranch after all their labor.
And I'm sorry to say that in the early 1900s, Sally also passed away. Now, I was lucky, though, because my mother Elizabeth and my sister Louisa both lived with us, and so they helped raise my 6 kids. And so that helped us get through that area. But again, I still needed a wife, and so I went out and found me another wife. I got Rebecca Sherwin for my wife.
I wasn't born Rebecca Sherwin. I was born Beulah Jenny. And so, but I married Grant Sherwin. I was born in Waupaca, Wisconsin, pretty good place. But oh, we liked the South. We came to the South. And we came to the Pasadena area. And when we got there, we weren't there very long, and Grant passed away. Oh, he passed away in 1912. So I came out to Santa Barbara. I had had an education in Wisconsin, and I was a teacher. Of course, an education to become a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse was not really much of a college education. I was lucky if I had a full year. But I married Edgar, and we were having a happy life together from 1912 until 1914.
Now, one of the other passions I had was for prohibition. And if you remember, in 1919, the U.S. passed the 18th Amendment, which outlawed the sale and consumption of alcohol. What you may not remember is that in 1871, Santa Barbara, Montecito, and Carpinteria passed a law eliminating the use of any alcohol in the home. The only problem was 2 weeks later the state Supreme Court struck it down. So we ended up having to live with drunks in this area for the next 45 years. My only hope is that the 18th Amendment stays in place forever, and that the only grapes that are ever used are to be eaten at the table and never drunk as wine.
And my Edgar passed away in 1914. And I was left to teach and find myself another husband.
My name is Martha Jane Williams Ellison Kellogg, and I was born in Merritt, Illinois in 1829. I'm just a wife, just a second wife, and a mother, and a stepmother. I'm nobody special. I certainly didn't do anything noteworthy in my life. As I look at my diary, I realize I never held office, never had much schooling, or made myself a fortune. Why, I never even had a job. Keeping house, that's what the census taker wrote every 10 years. So who am I that I should be speaking about my life? Must be a mistake, I thought. They should have asked my husband, Florentine Kellogg. Why, he did so much in his lifetime, they even named some streets after him. Anytime you see a street here in the Goleta Valley that's called Kellogg, well, that's because of Florentine, my Florentine. He was a hard-working, prosperous man, a farmer and a fruit grower. In 1848, he grew the first English walnuts in the northern part of California. And he was the first man to ship grapes, apples, and peaches to San Francisco. Florentine had 60 acres here in this beautiful valley of Goleta. And his stepson, my stepson Franklin Kellogg, why, they named Kellogg School after him because he was the first principal of Goleta's grammar school. Now, isn't that something? But Martha Jane Williams Ellison Kellogg, no one would ever name anything after me. I was just a wife, Mrs. Kellogg, and I wasn't even Mr. Kellogg's first wife. That honor was given to Rebecca Jane Williams, my father's sister. After poor Rebecca passed away, leaving Mr. Kellogg all alone with 7 small children, well, I was a widow with a young son, and back in those days, that would be reason enough for a couple to be married. So I became the second Mrs. Kellogg. You see, all my accomplishments are second-hand. The second wife, the second mother to the Kellogg children. But I will admit this. I took the care and training of Mr. Kellogg's children as though they were my own natural-born babies. I felt that my highest calling was to keep a clean, neat, pious home and fill it with warmth and good smells. My daily duties, and more about those in a minute, were often tedious and tiring, but they were important works assigned to me by my nature and by God. Now, more about my duties. We farm wives had a schedule. Monday was laundry day. I washed and put the clothes out to dry. Tuesday was ironing. That was hot work in the summertime, heating the irons on the stove. And of course, the little one's clothes seemed to need mending every week. Wednesday was my baking day. My, how my family loved the smell of cakes and pies that I made for them. Thursday was the day that I cleaned house, swept the floors, beat the carpets, and blacked the stove. I had no special chores on Friday, but this time of year I was always busy canning fruits and vegetables that we would eat in the winter months. Saturday, I baked and cleaned again, since I could not do those things on Sunday. Sunday was the Lord's Day. That was my schedule for the days of the week, but of course, every day I cooked 3 square meals, fed the chickens, tended to my kitchen garden, milked the cows, and still found time to love my husband and my children. I was never sick, I just didn't have time. So I wasn't special at all. I was like every other farm wife in the Goleta Valley. I just did what I could. And even though I had plenty to do, I made sure the children did their homework. That was especially important to me. And I think I made a difference. I really do. When Frank was little and couldn't sit still for the life of him, I made sure he did his lessons. I sat there with him to show him just how important learning was. And I may have given him an extra molasses cookie or two just to make sure those lessons went down just a little bit sweeter. And I'd like to think that's why Frank had a real love for learning. Off to college. College, imagine that. We sent him to Illinois College at Jacksonville, Illinois. He lived in Jacksonville with my mother, the woman who taught me to love learning. A woman who was just like me. Nobody special. Just a mother looking out for her young ones. Now here's a secret I've kept to myself all these years. Every time one of our young ones grew up tall and strong, started a family, or set off on his or her path into the world, well, that's when I felt special. That's when I knew I wasn't a nobody. I played a big part in this world. You won't find my accomplishments in any book. And maybe that's why I'm here today, on this beautiful morning in the Goleta Valley, to share with you a few lines from a poem that our dear son Frank wrote. It's called Goleta. Upon the borders of our land, hard by the broad Pacific strand, Goleta sits in verdure dressed, our own sweet home in the balmy west. Her mountains pierce like turrets high the vaulted archway of the sky, but even upon the loftiest spot, the ice and snowflakes linger not. While on the bleak Atlantic shore, the storm clouds brood and tempests roar, while winter reigns in other lands and binds the earth in frozen bands. The twittering swallow never leaves Goleta's barn and stable eaves. I couldn't be prouder than if I wrote it myself.
Problem with a cemetery like this one is it can't tell you much about a person. Oh, it's true, you can see a man's name, you see the date he was born and the date he died, you can see all that on a pretty piece of stone, but you don't really get to know a man's story, and if you don't know his story, you don't really know the man. Now, my name is, well, Captain R.P. Tucker, that's what it says right here. That's who it was. And the R, now that stood for, well, do you want to take a guess? Go ahead, you can guess. The R stood for reason. Reason was my first name. Now, I can't say I lived up to that though, because R for restless, now that would have been a little bit more appropriate. And the P, that stood for, well, you know, I'm going to tell you that a little bit later. Captain R.P. Tucker. Does that name sound familiar to you? There's a beautiful patch of land about 2.5 miles from here, Tucker's Grove. And I know then some of you have heard of that. But you can't give me credit for that though, because I left that land to my son, Charles. And when he died in 1912, didn't leave a will. So the land had to be sold at public auction, but the Goleta Women's Club, they got the whole community up in arms about saving my land for a public park. They made such a big fuss about that. That all them big fellas that bid on the land, well, they just pulled right out of that auction. All except one, Mr. George Edwards, banker. Good old George. He won that auction. Well, he was the only one in it. And I tell you, what he up and did was he gave that land to the community. Oh, you just pay me later. That's what he said. No charge for interest. And all because of the Goleta Women's Club. And I tell you, I know something about women. You don't ever want to go against the will of a woman. And the reason I know about women, I have 4 wives. Now, the first, that was Delilah. Ah, sweet Delilah. Yeah, I married her in Culpeper, Virginia. That's where I was born. And soon after we went and moved to Ohio in 1830, Delilah, she passed. So then my second marriage, that was to Mary Ann in Illinois. And now that's where the restless part does come in. You see, some years later, I packed up my oldest boys and we headed for California without Mary Ann. Now, in my defense, she was with child and with 3 other little ones at the house. So now I didn't hold it against her when she didn't come with us. But now, when she never heard from me once I got to California, now she held that against me. She had me declared dead. Boom, end of my marriage to Mary Ann. Married another man. So I started thinking, I figured that she thought that we perished on the way to California, that our wagon train didn't make it. And I can't say I blamed her, because the next wagon train that came through after us, well, that was a Donner Party. And many of them folks didn't make it. Snows came, food ran out. Well, some of them folks, they had to do some very bad things just to survive, get along. And I know this because when word came down from high up in the Sierras about that Donner Party needing help, well, I was one of the first to volunteer. Now, this is where my middle name got them to take notice of me. The P, that stood for Penelope. I swear in a stack of Bibles. Yeah, some of them folks, what they said was, well, hell, man with the name Penelope, that man got to be tough. So they made me head of the search party. That's how I got the name, the title, Captain R.P. Tucker. But I tell you, I would have gladly given up that title. I never would have volunteered for that search party if I'd have known the sights that would be facing us high up there in the Sierras. Some of them sights, they haunt me still, even in death. Sort of took the restlessness out of me. So what I did was, I moved to Napa, settled down, took up farming, and I married my third wife, Elizabeth, and I thought I would never leave Napa. But you know, just when you think you got life all figured out, it up and turns on you and it just throws you a curveball, and a fast one at that. Lost my home, lost my land. Because of a defective title and a lawsuit because of it. It just took it all away from me. And then my wife Elizabeth was taken from me. Elizabeth passed. So I had to move on. So in 1872 I moved right here to the Goleta Valley. Now this is where I met my fourth wife, another Mary Ann, but now this one took. I settled down for good. What I did was I built my home right over on what they now call Lassen Drive. And then I farmed a lot of this area right around you folks from, well, right from that Magnolia Center there, clear up to the foothills, Tucker's Grove. And by then, I had finally grown into my first name, Reason. Wasn't restless anymore. Finally found the home that I was looking for all the time. It was here all the time. Here in Goleta Valley.
My name is Sarepta Hardcastle Campbell. My husband and I had a walnut farm here in Goleta. Now I was born in beautiful, lush Greene County, Illinois in 1836. And I was born into a family of 5 children. My parents were farmers and settlers in Greene County. In fact, my father, William, had joined the group that fought the Black Hawk Indians and pushed them back across the Mississippi River to the west side, which left Illinois free to be settled. So I grew up there, had a wonderful childhood. David W. Campbell, my husband, was born in Tennessee in 1838, and he grew up in Tennessee. And he went to college. But during college, the Civil War started, and so the college closed. So David decided to come to Greene County, Illinois, to farm and do some teaching, which he did. By 1864, the war was still going, and the Union Army was anxious to get more people fighting with them, so they gave incentives. So David took one of the incentives, joined the Army, and fought for 100 days, and then came back to Greene County, Illinois. Now, he farmed there for a while. We met, we got married, we started our family, and we got ourselves a farm and farmed for 8 years in Greene County. It's a beautiful place. Good crops. But by 1875, we were beginning to read in the newspapers about this place called Santa Barbara, California. And they really made it sound wonderful. The articles talked about how from the mountains you could see the ocean, and in between on the plains there were flowers and fruit and groves of oak trees. And the biggest incentive that we latched onto was that there was no snow out here. Well, we were getting kind of tired of that snow in the wintertime in Illinois, even though our crops were good. So by 1882, we decided to move to California, to Santa Barbara. We brought our family, except one. Daisy decided to stay and never did come out to live in California. But the rest of us all came out to California, Santa Barbara. We lived on Chapala Street for a year until we decided what we were going to buy. And then we bought a walnut farm up on San Marcos Road near Cathedral Oaks. Proved to be a really good investment, and we really had a good time and an easy time growing those walnuts. The deal with the walnuts was that I guess hard-shelled English walnuts had come in earlier, but Joseph Sexton about 1860 decided that he wanted to bring in the soft-shelled walnuts and see if he could raise those here. So he imported 120 pounds of soft-shelled walnuts, planted them down at his nursery at Montecito and Castillo Streets, and after a year took the softest shelled ones that had grown and brought them out and planted them in his nursery on Patterson. So that's how we came to have walnut trees on our property, was those soft-shelled walnuts that were descended from the ones that Joseph Sexton had brought out. Now, the walnuts like this area because it was balmy, good weather here. They didn't have to be watered unless it was a really drought year. And the harvesting was simple. All you had to do was go and shake the trees. So we got the whole neighborhood, all the kids, and every year, we would shake the trees to get them to fall down on the ground so we could pick them up and sell them. Also, David was instrumental in bringing in tractors for his walnut trees. Nobody else did. They all used a horse and plow. And what they did was they cut the roots of the walnut trees. And by cutting the roots, that forced new roots to grow and new nourishment for the trees, because the nourishment for the trees was in the roots. So he was quite famous for having brought in his tractors to use, and they wrote him up in articles all over California. Our family consisted of Edgar, our child, our son, our red-bearded doctor's son, who went to Stanford and University of California to get his MD, and while he was there he also ended up getting a missionary license. So he came back and he worked for a year, 10 years, in Goleta as a doctor, and married Frances Kellogg, one of our neighbors. And then they decided to go to Alaska to be missionaries. So they went up for 10 years to Alaska, and while they were there they adopted a little Eskimo girl and then had one of their own. So I ended up with 2 grandchildren from Edgar. After 10 years they came home in time for the First World War to start. So Edgar was in the Medical Corps in France for the U.S. Army. When he came back, we were so proud of Edgar, and we ended up willing him our farm when we died. Our second daughter, Maud, she went to university too, but while she was there she lost her eyesight and became blind. So she came back down to us on our ranch and lived with us on our ranch for the rest of her life. Now everybody always commented though, even though she was blind, she did the most amazing things. So she was noted throughout the valley for how well she handled her lack of sight. Lita was 5 when we moved here, and she grew up here, and she married Franklin Lane, one of the Lane family. And Frank ended up being like a second son to us and worked with us on our ranch. Now, socially, we had a good time in this valley, too. All the neighbors knew each other, and we all played together, and the kids all grew up together. And so we had a couple of places that we used to go to socialize. We'd go down to Moore Ranch Landing and have picnics and pick up Chumash Indian relics while we were walking on the beach. We could visit the Giordano's, who had a dairy farm down there. Their boys grew up and became grocers. And the other place that we socialized was Joseph Sexton had built a community center, and the top floor was like a dance floor. So we, on the weekends or in between, the kids and the adults could go down there and dance and socialize. We kicked up our heels so much and had so much fun dancing there that Mr. Sexton was afraid the hall was going to fall down. So he went and built a new hall for us on his ranch out on Patterson Avenue. So then we really could kick up our heels, dance, socialize, have plays, anything we could think of. We had fun. Now the best thing about this social hall for the mothers was that he built a balcony around the dance floor so that we could be chaperones and make sure our kids didn't get into trouble. That really relieved us. And we also had it set up so that when the boys got rowdy and went outside and were carrying on out there, we had our blacksmith. He would come and he would make sure the boys understood they weren't supposed to be rowdy. So it all worked out really well. By 1921, in May, 2 months after David died, I died at Cottage Hospital. I died of peritonitis and heart trouble. Now, it's been a good life here. I'm so happy to be buried with my friends and family. Several of them are buried here with me, and it's a wonderful day.